Alright, so today we're going to be talking about the Yu-Gi-Oh! Ban list and the real reason behind the hits, releases, and the rest of it. Do ban lists really balance out the format, or are they just a device for pushing product? Please share your thoughts in the comments down below and like the video if you enjoy it as well. So, to start things off, I want to talk about the first ever ban list, which pretty much came as a necessity. And next up, we have a blog post which I wanted to bring up because Konami kind of answered the question of why do ban lists actually exist. Now, sadly, this is a blog post from March 1st, 2012, and if any of you are familiar with one of the weirdest ban lists ever, it was the March 1st, 2012 ban list. So yeah, they pretty much made a blog post saying how ban lists have got to exist because you never want a situation where you are locked into being forced to playing a single deck or a specific assortment of cards, and to also restrict solitaire play. And I guess in this video, I wanted to bring up all of these points and see if they actually, quote unquote, kept their word. If the ban lists are still here to prevent those types of situations from happening. And then we come to some of the weird ban lists. And that's when it started to become fairly apparent that those points we talked about before are not their only goal in this game's existence. So let's actually talk about the March 2012 chaos that ensued, pretty much. What happened was XYZ Monsters got released, and the entire ban list felt like it just existed to hit synchro cards. And they did make a blog post, like we said, and they pretty much justified all of their decisions, which, you know, on an unrelated note, it's great that they actually still made posts and actually talked about their decisions, which is not a case anymore, but we'll get to the lack of communication a little later in the video. So yeah, pretty much they hit stuff that wasn't really that important anymore, and some players say that due to TCG and OCG still having the same ban list at that point, some hits were warranted, which might be the case, but we cannot ignore the fact that some of the most broken cards of that era were not addressed. And I think it's needless to say that players were not happy with those decisions. So this kind of set the tone for ban lists moving forward, and I guess the next thing I wanted to touch upon would be some emergency ban lists, because if all of the points that Konami made really do, I guess, apply, emergency ban lists should be there to balance out the game. It's literally what they were supposed to be made for. However, in my opinion, and it might be in opinion of others as well, I think they are criminally underutilized. And even right now, as I'm speaking, a lot of players are calling and crying out for an emergency ban list, which of course, everybody has their opinions on it. But yeah, we have some interesting emergency ban lists to talk about as well, which seemed like they still existed to just deal with the biggest issues. The first card that was emergency banned, where it was just one card, it's Cyberstein. You know, when Cyberstein came into the game and pretty much every single player played it, they just decided to remove it. And then we had the adjusted list, which was pretty much a list that dealt with some of the most broken cards in the Pepe strategy, which, you know, also some players were kind of hateful towards. It was not the most loved deck, but the ban list didn't actually address it. What they did was release this adjusted list where stores could incorporate it if they wanted to and enforce it at their tournaments, but they weren't obliged to. And then when the actual ban list dropped, they just incorporated the changes as part of the ban list. And then there's also like some random emergency lists that happen over the years, like, you know, dealing with Dodd and Return from the Different Dimension, Allure of Darkness. There's just a lot of things that got hit at various points in time. I personally witnessed the ban list where Gofu, Spiral Gear Drone, and also Set Rotation were hit. For the most part, it seemed as though these ban lists were here to just address the biggest issues, where a lot of times when you see a card dominate, especially for months on end, like, you could just deal with it. Like, it's literally your game. And this might be a little, I guess, naive of me to say, but I don't think it's a problem to just release a ban list, hit one card that is completely dominating the format, and then release a regular ban list like a month or two down the line. So I guess that's food for thought, but I do think emergency ban lists are, just underutilized, like I said. So let's talk about the actual business model of Konami, which pretty much is, we have to make money for our investors. Obviously, you want to have just a good fiscal year. You want to satisfy all of the demands, and you can do that by pushing product, by selling the product to not the majority of your player base, actually, but to the people that spend the most. Because if we look at our player base, the majority are casual players, let's be real. But the ones that actually enter the tournaments and the ones that travel to all of the events are going to spend the biggest amounts of money. So you want to keep pushing those products. And when it comes to business models of other games, people like to complain a lot, but they're actually vastly different. If you look at fighting games like LoL or whatever, there's patches, there's just different, there's a different approach, because at the end of the day, those developers, at least for the most part, actually want the players to enjoy in a balanced game. You're going to bring a lot of player base into it, and you can just release patches on a very regular basis. Whereas in Yu-Gi-Oh, we have ban lists like literally 3 to 4 times a year. And before that, we even had it like every 6 months. So that's something to think about. And there's a difference, obviously. Not to mention that here in the TCG, I think this should go without saying, but we are not the OCG. And a lot of times players tend to complain and completely forget about that, because the actual environment of card games in the OCG is completely different, because there's actual competition there. So they do have to think about bringing the game to the players and making it much more balanced and also accessible when it comes to prices, because there's actually a lot of other games that they have to compete with. Whereas in the TCG, we literally have Magic, Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh! Like One Piece is gaining traction. But before that, we only had those 3 games. So to me, it feels like Konami was just kind of content with how things were going, because the game was still getting sold and getting more and more popular. Post that debacle in 2012 and around the time of XYZ Monsters, when players were pretty much saying the game is quote-unquote dead, it actually exploded in popularity. And then Links got released, a lot of really good structure decks and interesting formats, and just more and more players were brought into the game. But did the ban list really have a lot to do with that? That's what we're going to look at today. So let's talk about some patterns that you have to look at when you're thinking about cards getting hit, and just patterns we have seen in the past. The number one question we have to ask ourselves, sadly, and it's just the way it is did the card that we're thinking of hitting actually receive a reprint yet? And if the answer is no, probably 99% of the time it's not going to get hit. And we have some really great examples of that. Let's take a look at 2019 Megatins. It saw the reprints of Thunder Dragons, Sky Strikers, some of the most popular strategies at the moment. And then fast forward to the January 2020 ban list, when all of those popular decks got completely neutered on the ban list. And I think it's fairly obvious at this point. The second they sell their reprints, it doesn't really matter anymore whether or not the game is actually balanced, or, they just want to move on to the next shiny thing that they're going to introduce to the players. Then we have the next pattern, which is going to be hitting cards to push other strategies. And there's a lot of examples of that, but the most recent one, probably not that great, there might be better examples, but it's just the one that came to mind, is Rescue Ace. Let's talk about Airlifter going to 1, and then we just became completely overwhelmed by everything else fire. And it's important to say everything else, because Rescue Ace is kind of falling off. So let's ask ourselves, is it really warranted for a deck that's breaking anyway to lose two of its really important starters just so they can introduce broken cards that just push other fire strategies? There's literally Snake Eyes and a lot of the same cards, Promethean Princess, etc., seeing play in all of these decks. Rescue Ace, Snake Eye, Fire King Snake Eye, all of them. But they hit a deck that just wasn't as important anymore. Not to mention they reprinted Turbulence and Hydrant, which were both the sought-after money cards of the archetype. And then they just shifted their attention to new fire decks and completely threw Rescue Ace to the sidelines. And we saw this a lot in, I guess, just over the years in general. There's a lot of printing of archetypes and cards that do very, very similar things. But we'll get to that a little later. The next pattern is bringing cards back just to push product, because we have also seen this happen as well. One of the most recent examples is the unbanning of Snow in tier format. So, I think it's needless to say that the card is way too broken and it should have been banned for the entirety of this time. But when they released an archetype that is very conveniently milling cards and just being broken, because we all know what tier did, of course they had to give us Snow as well to kind of insinuate us to buy into the hype, to buy the strategy, to play it at full power, and then, they just dealt with it a couple months later. And Snow went back to being banned as if nothing happened. And I think those are issues that have got to be talked about. Another example is Dryden coming back in Zodiac Eldritch format. Granted, it was during COVID, everything around that time was just a little weird, but when Dryden came back, it almost immediately got banned as well. And not to mention, that time saw the release of Zeus, which is still to this point one of the most important Xyz monsters in the game. And what better way of achieving Zeus with as many materials as possible than with Zodiac monsters. So again and again, we see examples of cards getting released just for the sole purpose of pushing product and then getting hit later once the cards that were, broken to begin with get hit or just power crept. So let's talk about some of the really negative things when it comes to the ban list in regards to product, format, and also the balance of the game. I already touched upon printing strategies that are very similar to something that already is hit. And since we talked about Dryden, I think this is the best, segue into the next thing. Basically, let's compare Trident to Masterpiece to Arise Heart. And all of them have something in common. Now, for the most part, it's just going to be the destruction or banishing of a card as a quick effect. And seeing as how all of these cards do a very similar thing, it really begs the question of why are Trident and Masterpiece still banned while Arise Heart was legal? And then obviously it got hit a couple months later because, again, they just wanted to print new cards, people got bored of the format, and honestly, I don't think it was about balancing the game as much, but people were just sick of it and they were not going to further invest into the game and into the product. The next thing is hitting cards when it doesn't really make sense anymore. And we saw recent examples of Mystic Mine, Curious, and also Isolde. And of course, there's other examples of that, but if you remember the time of Mystic Mine being the most hated card under the sun, and it just wasn't hit. It just was not hit. When they hit it, it just didn't really matter anymore. And there's also Curious and Isolde. Those were cards that we deemed ban-worthy almost the second they got released, because you can tell when a card is completely busted and then it just keeps on being utilized and exploited pretty much in other strategies as well. But they hit them when it didn't really matter. So there's that. We started off the video with talking about a really weird ban list. So I guess in light of that, I also want to talk about Assault Core being limited while Firewall was still legal. And I think this is just at this point, it's just funny, but almost everyone knows of this example. It's just really sad to see that they would just hit an archetype that did nothing wrong to keep a card that, is pretty much a selling point of their anime legal. And with that, I want to turn back to the original statement we read from the blog post, where it said that Banlists, hold on, I want to actually read it. I think this is really important. So Banlists exist to restrict a solitaire play deck. And these are usually first turn combo decks where one duelist plays by themselves for 15 minutes, shuffling and summoning cards while their opponent twiddles his thumbs. And I think all of us were just, how do you put it, twiddling our thumbs while our opponents did firewall combos because they just refused to ban firewall. So again, we see them going back on their word and just doing something that's completely opposite of what their initial goal was. The next thing is the lack of communication. We read a blog post from 2012, and I know that they recently released like a little statement when it comes to one of the ban lists, but I forget because they don't actually release those posts regularly. There is never an actual explanation of why the ban list happened, what the hits are, like why they deemed them to be necessary, why they brought cards back. Because in reality, if they gave us real reasons, it would be along the lines of, we hit this card because, we just printed a new strategy that goes that's completely opposite to the old strategy. So now we don't want you to play with that anymore because you have to buy our new cards. They are secret rare, they are short printed, and it's just something you're gonna have to do because we just banned your cards. That's it. And I don't think that's a statement they actually want to release to the public. So let's move on to some really unhealthy things that to an extent still exist because they refuse to ban it. There are examples of really busted boss monsters that were just not hit, and Firewall is among those, but the most, current thing would be King Calamity. It is used in Centurion, which is not a cheap archetype at all, and usually stuff that's released in side sets, it is much more, sought after because you don't have as many copies available on the market, and it's expensive. So why would they hit a card in their mind, of course, that is pushing a strategy and pushing people to buy it, when if they ban it, the strategy is not going to be as relevant anymore, because sometimes these archetypes that aren't as great just need really, really broken win conditions. And for the longest time, we've been complaining about Branded Expulsion, for example, which it got hit. But what they did was they released Sanctifier Dragon, which is literally the exact same card in monster form. So what they do is they make us think they dealt with a problem when in reality they already have literally different iterations of the same card lined up to get released in future products. Going back to that blog post, I also want to talk about the first point, which was to prevent a situation where you feel locked in, where you have to play with certain cards or a certain deck. And that also ties back to our Mystic Mind problem, for example, where you had to build differently. Also in tier format, it was really similar. Also Kashira format. Now that I think about it, there's many more examples. Like you were forced to build your decks differently because of some of the most dominant strategies. And again, that is in contrary to what they said the ban list was supposed to be for, because they refused to hit those cards. The next point is to keep it so there are choices for what deck you play. Avoid having one dominant deck. And I guess this ties into tier 0 formats. Now, this could be a whole separate video on its own, so I won't get into it too much because we have different opinions on tier 0 formats in general, but their idea was to never have one dominant deck. So I guess the question to ask is, what happened with that? And I guess for the last point, to eliminate cards that are confusing, cause game states to stall out, create infinite loops, etc. I guess this is something they take care of here and there, they do try and prevent FTKs and stuff like that, but even then, it takes them a while, like slash draw FTK and stuff like that. It's been around, like, for some time. And then it got hit, thankfully. Now, I guess we talked about a lot of negative things, I think, in this video, so I do want to touch upon some of the positives of what are some good things that the ban list actually brings. And what I really liked about the COVID part of Yu-Gi-Oh! Is the fact that when they released Adamantia, this was in spring, and they actually let us play with the cards until fall. The next ban list that was actually relevant was September, and they hit Block Dragon. They dealt with a strategy that was a little too busted, if we're being completely honest, but they did not take away the investments. A lot of times you see it happen that, you invest into some product and they actually let you play with the cards for some time. And that's also why I think that they're not going to hit fire stuff that soon, because it was extremely, extremely expensive. So at least they let you play with cards for a period of time. And another thing is that a lot of times ban lists will actually bring players back to the game, because a very degenerate strategy got hit to actually balance the game out a little bit, and then more players can actually come back. I guess what I was just talking about reminded me of another point I wanted to make, which is actually negative as well, but I don't know, let's just talk about it. What I really dislike is the fact that they hit cards that are cheap. And we cannot go past that. It is so obvious. If we take a look at the ban list right now, there are super heavy hits, Unchained hits, Math Mech hits, and all of these cards that were for the most part actually released as support were very, very cheap. Circular was a super, Shavara was a common, super heavy like Samurai the Scarecrow Link was also not expensive, and in turn a lot of these decks as a whole were not expensive either. And what they did was, for example with Unchained, they did not reprint the sought after cards. They never gave us a reprint of Prison or of the links, and the links just became more and more expensive, to Prison as well. And they didn't really seem to care, because Shavara, the support card, was a common, and when they were done with Unchained, they just decided to limit it, completely hinder consistency, and it was very similar to Math Mech. And a lot of times these hits just don't make that much sense. Like Unchained, yes, it needed to be hit. Math Mech as well. But then if you take a look at Math Mech Circular being banned at the point in time when it was baffling to the majority of the player base, because it didn't really pose a threat. So again, they just want to push other products, and they're going to preemptively hit some cards and decks as a whole when they don't really care about them, when it's not making them money, so they can just eliminate them out of the meta and push new cards. So I asked us a question of, do ban lists balance out the game or push product? And I think for the majority of this video, I was just talking about pushing the product. So I do think the answer is fairly obvious. I do want to hear your thoughts as well, but I'm gonna leave you with one final thought, which is that no matter if the ban lists sometimes do balance the game out, and if we have some healthy formats or diverse formats, which a lot of people seem to enjoy, we need to think about the actual underlying issue, which is how far gone the game actually is when it comes to power creep, when it just comes to them printing new cards that are more and more broken, and it seems like they have backed themselves up into a corner and don't really know where to go from here. So what we have to be talking about, in my opinion, is how to solve things, how to save the game, how to make it much more enjoyable for players, and more accessible as well. So if you have any thoughts on that topic as well, I would love to hear them in the comments. And yeah, it's been a while since I've done a discussion type video like that. So if you enjoyed it, if you found it interesting, please give it a like and let me know down in the comments. And I will be making more, because I really, really enjoy talking about the game. So yeah, hope you're here for the ride. And of course, you can do that by being notified. So ding the bell, sub to the channel, and I'll catch you in the next video.